I guess that on the Richter scale of political earthquakes, the speaking order has something to do with the fact that France is really in a very bad shape. We like to think that it's just as bad on this side of the channel for the mainstream political parties, but that I guess Tony will explain to us later, that maybe it's not as bad as the French case. As you all know, both mainstream political parties in France are in complete ruins since last Sunday. The left, the Socialist Party in government, scored 14%, which is its lowest ever. If you add all the fringe leftist parties, the total is 33%, which is the lowest ever for the left, which shows, by the way, that the translation between social and economic crises does not necessarily go to the extreme left. On the conservative side, it's just as bad. The UMP scored 20%, much less than it did at the last European elections. And it's only the small centrist party which scored 10% and which claims a very small victory. So let's talk about the victor. The victor, 25%. Marine Le Pen has won in 3 years a very major victory, not only over her own father and over the all-time dyed-in-the-wool far-right French, dating back to the Algerian War. The father has been at it for 40 years. Marine Le Pen has been at it for 3 years, and it's a remarkable victory for her in the sense that she has managed to give the Front National her face, her voice, her obvious delight in playing the part, and a great deal of energy. And she's been very smart also in putting forward highly educated people who, by French standards, you know, it always has to do with our school system, the ENA, HEC. So she has 2 of these prototypes, including, starting with Philippot, who is the number 2, and who has played a major role in this campaign. Now, the Front National, it's layer after layer: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, anti-globalization, anti the Anglo-Saxon liberal market economy, which, as you know, to the French, to most of the French, including the conservatives, is almost sinful. And then, on top of it, anti-Europe. But it's interesting that the anti-EU argument is not, it's really the fig leaf, if I may use that bad expression. It's been the wrapping of the Marine Le Pen's tactics. It's not the core. And actually, the Front National is as divided about the EU as any other French political party, would they be the conservatives or the left. You always have a dividing line, and within the Front National, not all of them agree about exiting the euro. Not all of them agree at all about leaving Europe. So the explanation for Marine Le Pen's victory has been her hard hitting at the elites, at the establishment, and at the weakness of the state, which relates to a very profound tradition in France, that the state is supposed to be the overall protector of the French. And somehow the state, as it has been run by the mainstream parties for all these years, has proved unable to protect low-income people and the young who voted significantly for the Front National from unemployment and lower and lower perspectives. What is also interesting is that you have second-generation immigrants voting for the Front National for pretty much the same reasons. Now, where does that leave us now, a few days later? Well, as far as the conservatives are concerned, They are embroiled in a terrible financial scandal, which caused Jean-François Copé to resign. He will actually quit in a couple of weeks. This scandal has to do with the financing of the last presidential campaign, so it's likely to rebound over to Nicolas Sarkozy, who was hoping to play the savior after a little while. His chances seem to be compromised. And so it's Alain Juppé, who was the most unpopular prime minister ever, but everything changes in politics. So he's now very popular, and indeed he seems to be the most able to pick up the ruins of the Conservatives and also to try and make sense of a Conservative alliance with the center. As to the left, well, there's now open criticism within the Socialist Party, not only of government policies, which both the President and the Prime Minister repeated they couldn't change just because of Marine Le Pen, but there's now open criticism of the President himself, of his ability to do the job, and obviously of his ability to run again next time, in 3 years' time. François Hollande, as you know, has the lowest ever popularity rating in the history of the Fifth Republic. Yesterday, new figures came out. Unemployment has kept rising in spite of all his engagements and promises. And there are 12 billion euros missing in the budget. And so the news is really quite bleak. It's obvious that because of the Front National, there will be a push to the right. The whole French political scene will be pushed to the right. And it may just be a coincidence, but it so happens that yesterday at Calais, the police dismantled the migrant camp with many, many TV cameras around. On Tuesday night, François Hollande was in Brussels, facing his colleagues at the European Union. He tried to convince them that France is their common problem and that, in fact, his poor performance is a common European problem. I'm not sure, to put it mildly, that he's been very convincing in that sense. Now, just to sum up, I hope I'm not overdoing it. Just as a conclusion,
yes, please.
The French being French, it was striking to me last night watching a TV debate in the mainstream, on the public channel. And the journalist anchoring this channel, a very good journalist, suddenly told one of the debaters, well, I mean, you pick. Why are they snobbing our Front National? And so that tells you a lot about French sensitivities, that somehow the country is in shock. But the fact that the Brits could snob our Front National and not agree to ally with them in the European Parliament, it's quite difficult to take. And what is even worse and more serious is, of course, Mr. Schäuble's remark about Front National being a fascist party. And that also created a stir among people who are not at all to be suspected of any sympathy for the Front National. But I would just like to sum up again about this very French sensitivities that, of course, we are under shock, but somehow let us not, the Brits and the Germans, give us too many lessons, please.
Look, I mean, in comparison to what Christine told us, my talk can be really summarized very briefly. Election results, unremarkable. Domestic implications, negligible. Short-term implications at the European level, obvious. And long-term European implications, who knows? Now, let me elaborate a little bit on that. The election result was unremarkable. There's nothing sort of particularly interesting happened, nothing comparable to what happened in France or in the UK or in many other European countries. Turnout was actually a bit up to 48%, which is well below what we normally have at federal elections, but an encouraging sign. There are a number of reasons we could go into for that. The CDU, the Chancellor's party, did okay, didn't do particularly well, but didn't do badly. She will have taken some delight in the fact that the Christian Social Union, a coalition partner, did rather do badly, but that doesn't reflect on her, it only reflects on them. The Social Democrats did better than last time, but not so spectacularly well that the Chancellor would have any reason to worry about their result. There is still an 8% difference between what the Social Democrats got and what the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union got, so that is a comfortable difference. The Greens and the left did pretty much as they did last time. They don't need to worry, but there is nothing for them to cheer about. The Liberals knew after the federal elections that they would be in for drubbing again, so that result is unremarkable. The only interesting thing, if you want to find something interesting in those elections, is that the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, won 7%, which is remarkable because they actually managed to get the same number of votes that they did in the federal elections, even so turnout, of course, in the European elections is much lower. So in fact, they actually did better than at the federal elections. They managed to poll about 2 million. This party is a party of the right, both on socio-economic issues and on the libertarian, authoritarian dimension. There's no doubt that it is a party of the right. It occupies some of the space vacated by the FDP, but also some of the space vacated by the Christian Democrats, who over the years during Merkel's chancellorship have moved to the left, to the center and to some extent to the left, and in a sense created a space on the right, and they're occupying that. It is not a populist party. That would be my contention here. It is not a populist party, and it's certainly not a extreme right-wing party in any shape or form. The domestic implications of all this are by necessity, because the election results themselves were unremarkable, are limited. There was no unexpected outcome, no collapse, no surge of any particular party. The current government of the Christian Democrats, the Christian Social Union and the Social Democrats have a comfortable majority as a result of this election. So the domestic implications are limited, and they are even more limited because there is no other big election looming in Germany now for several years. I mean, European elections can matter very much if there is another election, like a federal election, or in the case of the UK, an upcoming general election around. That's not the case in Germany. We just had our federal elections in all the big Länder, Bavaria, Hesse, North Rhine-Westphalia, Lower Saxony, had their elections too. So the government can now look forward to several years of tranquility. This election has, in a sense, reinforced or reconfirmed the current governing formula. So I'm afraid I don't have to tell you, there's nothing particularly interesting I can tell you about the domestic implications. No, I have no stories such as the ones from France or from the UK. The short-term implications at the EU level, well, of course, Merkel is to some extent hemmed in by the fact that Schulz ran as a sort of candidate for the European Social Democrats. He won't become president of the Commission. She will have to give him something. But she has an advantage over many of her European colleagues, namely she has time. She can play for time, and that's, of course, what she already announced she was going to do. She's not going to be pushed into anything quickly, and she doesn't have to. She's not facing she's not facing unrest in her party. She's not facing any unrest in the country. She's not facing any major elections, she or her party. So she's got time, and she's going to play for time until a tableau of people and a new tableau of policies emerges. And I think that is her key advantage, that she is at the moment able to take a long time horizons, unlike many of her counterparts in other parts of Europe. This all sounds sort of fairly rosy, at least from a German perspective. But of course, if you have to, I can say this here, if you have to look to Italy in order to sort of, in order to put a brave face on things and think, it's not so bad. I mean, there are good sort of things happening, and then you sort of point to the election results in Italy. It tells you something. Of course she has a problem. She has a problem on the one hand, of course, with France, and how can you agree on a reform agenda, either in policy terms or institutionally, with such a weakened government? And she has a problem, on the other hand, with Cameron. Now, Wolfgang Schäuble, who was already mentioned, of course, he's very keen that many of the things which were done over the last 2 to 3 years on the basis of intergovernmental treaties, European Stability Mechanism, and so on and so forth, most of which has been regulated outside the treaties, the Germans are very keen to bring that into the treaties. That requires treaty reform, but it's very difficult to see that the main governments or the major governments that would be needed in order to agree on such treaty reforms are willing or capable of delivering that. So although domestically she's doing well in terms of developing a European agenda, in terms of regularizing many of the arrangements which have grown up during the crisis in order to bring this into the treaties, I can't quite see how that is going to happen. So I think for me this is a very worrying long-term implication, because it will mean that, in a sense, the two Europes which have grown up, one which is a Europe of the treaties, and one which is a Europe, in a sense, with all the arrangements that have grown up during the crisis period, which is largely intergovernmental, which also means that neither European Parliament has a strong say, nor national parliaments have a strong say in these arrangements. This must be worrying for the Germans, who do like to have neat constitutional arrangements and be on sure grounds, including legal grounds. And she has to be also, of course, if she looks to our German Federal Constitutional Court, that does take these type of things very seriously. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
I think I'll follow Klaus's method of dealing with the domestic political implications first, and then sort of broaden it out to the European dimension. Now, a lot of you will be extremely familiar with the way this has been discussed in the media in the last few days here in Britain. But nevertheless, to take it sort of party by party, looking at the result for the Liberal Democrats, the junior government party, there is clearly an emerging mood of something approaching panic in the party. Should they dump their leader 1 year before the national election? Are they looking at a possible complete wipeout in the Westminster Parliament after being reduced to only one MEP as a result of last weekend's election? Or do they do the brave thing and say, we stand on our record of having entered government for the first time in many decades in 2010 because there was a national emergency and it was our national duty to do so, and we're proud of having done that, and judge us by that? And do they stick to the private polling that suggests that they wouldn't be wiped out next year? They could still hold on to something like 30 of their, I think it was 56 seats that they won in 2010. So these are difficult times for them. It's really about, do they hold their nerve or not? For Labour, I think the problem that emerged from these elections is the question over the suitability of David Miliband as Prime Minister, whether he's come across as convincing enough to the electorate. This could be... We'll see whether they address that, but I mean, he's not going to disappear as the leader of the next 12 months, so they will fight with him as the prospective leader. I think the interesting result is UKIP, and here you've got to look at how did they do around the country. Their vote really did significantly increase in parts of southern England, the West Midlands, the East Midlands, and the North. They got one seat in Scotland, but where they didn't do well was London, let alone the rest of Scotland. And I think this is very telling. It suggests that there will be real limits to how far they can expand their vote. And I don't know if any of among you picked up a copy of tonight's Evening Standard, but the splash on the front page was about how the population of London is going to expand even more in the next 15 years. And this will have an effect on, this will have an electoral effect as time passes. London is detaching itself from the rest of Britain in terms of the way people vote. So there will be limits to UKIP's advance. Nevertheless, it's going to make more progress than it did after the 2009 European elections. And a reasonable estimate would be that it would keep about 50% of the vote it got last week, which was, 27.5% of the total vote. So you could see them getting something like 14% of the national vote, which would mean some seats in Westminster. Would it be enough to hold the balance of power in a hung parliament? Very difficult to tell at this stage. A lot will depend on how successfully either the Tories or Labour manage to reclaim those parts of the electorate that they lost to UKIP over the last 12 months. So an awful lot to play for there, but I would expect UKIP to be a force of some importance in the eventual outcome of the 2015 election. How does this play into Britain's position in the EU? Well, for Prime Minister Cameron, it raises a question, not for the first time in his premiership, of having priorities for himself and his government and for the Conservative Party, which simply aren't the same as the priorities for most other European leaders. By which I mean he's nailed his colours to the mast of a renegotiation of Britain's terms of membership, ideally, in his view, by a treaty change. But as we just heard, there isn't an appetite for that sort of far-reaching treaty change in other European capitals, certainly not in Paris. Therefore, it seems to me rather unlikely that he would be able to deliver a sufficiently wide-ranging renegotiation of Britain's membership to satisfy the Eurosceptic wing of, and others who want these sorts of changes in the Tory party. I just don't think the two ends of this dilemma can be knitted together satisfactorily for him. Could he get sufficient degree of change without actually getting a new comprehensively reformed EU treaty? I don't think so. I think Chancellor Merkel is willing to help a little bit, but again, nothing like as much as would be regarded as necessary in the Tory party. Now, not everything is swimming against him on the European front. I think Britain looks a little bit less isolated in the way it's been critical of the direction of things in the EU as a result of these elections. The argument that the regulatory instincts of Brussels need to be curbed, the idea that national parliaments might play a larger role in EU affairs, the idea that you've got to focus on core issues of business competitiveness. These are British themes, and they probably resonate a little more loudly now as a result of the elections. But I think that the Prime Minister is probably going to use up an awful lot of his capital in Brussels on squashing the attempt of Jean-Claude Juncker to be the Commission President. He will probably be successful, I should think, because there are others who agree either publicly or sotto voce with him on this. But once he's achieved that, he will have used up most of that capital I spoke of, and I don't think there'll be much more he'll be able to get on that front. And we'll have to see who might emerge as the Commission President choice in any case, because the record ever since the appointment of Jacques Delors is that you tend to get a kind of lowest common denominator appointment. The main takeaway from all this, though, I think, is that the most important debates on the continent concern the future of the Eurozone, the strengthening of the architecture of the Eurozone, which just went through this near-death experience, how to generate economic growth, what's the balance between economic growth and fiscal discipline. These are terribly important subjects. They need intensive discussions between Berlin and Paris and others. And Britain, just frankly, is just on the sidelines of most of this. And the attempt to drag in the discussion about renegotiating British membership is seen in a lot of other EU capitals as a bit of a distraction, frankly. So I think with that, I'm going to stop.